Great, thank you. We're just letting everybody fill in the room here. It looks like we got a tremendous amount of attendance on this program. And on behalf of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's Entertainment Law section, which is the largest of its kind in the world, and Beverly Hills Bar Association's Criminal Law section, welcome to this special panel on Rust and Baldwin, Lessons to be Learned from a Tragedy. Now, the materials for this program are comprehensive, and I want to thank Christine Lynn O'Connor and others for putting that together. There should be a link there if you don't have it already, but there is a tremendous amount of information in these materials. It's a great resource guide, and with links to a lot of things on the internet, including Alec Baldwin's interview, and with time codes there that we may be referring to. You can do Q&A here throughout the program, and I encourage you to do that and drop those questions into the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring those, and as that's relevant during the program, we'll try to address everybody's program. We're not going to save any time at the end for it. We're going to do it real time during the program. Now, to introduce the panel, we have Bryan Carpenter, who for over 20 years has worked in private security business, tactical military, law enforcement, private sector agencies all over the world as a professional trainer. And now he's the owner of Dark 30 Film Services, which specializes in safety and realism training and armorer services. He's also at 13 South Productions, where he's producing films. Bryan is working with the DA's office in New Mexico on this matter, so there's some limitations, of course, on what he can say, but very experienced person and very happy to have him. We also have Heather Pearson, who's in-house general counsel for the International Cinematographers Guild, IATSE Local 600, which is a labor union representing camera workers on movies and theatrical productions. Previously, she was senior counsel at the Writers Guild of America West and had private law firm practice before that. And to me, really impressive, formerly a captain in the United States Army. Then we have Richard Kaplan, who's a partner at Kaplan Marino in Los Angeles. He's a criminal defense attorney, both in state and federal court. He's doing complex white-collar crime and traditional criminal cases. He's representing pro athletes, entertainment industry professionals, doctors, lawyers, and such. He formerly was a president of the Beverly Hills Bar Association and served on the executive council for national conferences of bar presidents. And then myself, Christopher Melcher, I'm a legal commentator or analyst for several media outlets and covering this story. Formerly a criminal defense attorney when I started my practice, have a law enforcement background, and now I am a divorce attorney handling high stakes matters for family law cases. So, we are going to do a deep dive on this incident and looking at it from all of our various different perspectives and having a pretty vigorous debate on what happened, what should have happened, and what we can learn from it. What we share in common is empathy for everyone involved. This was a tragedy. Halyna Hutchins was killed as a result of the misuse of a firearm on a set, and director Joel Sousa was seriously injured. Alec Baldwin's life, of course, is turned upside down, being the one handling the firearm when it went off. And, you know, the crew on the set that witnessed this, their families. So even though we're going to be looking at this with a very critical eye, we all share the empathy for everyone that's been affected by it. The way that we're going to go through this is really building first a foundation for gun safety, because not everybody grew up with guns or has that training. And so we want to start there and talk about what are the basics for gun safety and basically how guns should be handled if they're going to be introduced onto a film set safely to avoid incidents like this. Then we're going to talk about what actually happened on this production, as far as we know from reporting. Then we're going to talk about the charges that were announced against Alec Baldwin and the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, and have a pretty vigorous debate here about whether this is criminal or not, what the strengths of the prosecution case could be, and what the defenses are likely to be. And then finally, and most importantly, what we can learn from this to prevent it from happening again. So I want to start with Bryan and talk to you, Bryan, about, or how have you explained to us, first of all, just basic rules of gun safety. So if you were going to teach anyone how to handle a gun, what are just the core rules for safety of a firearm? And then what specifically needs to be done on a movie set? And also want to make clear here, or if you can make clear, that this was a real firearm. It wasn't a prop gun. It wasn't a toy gun. This was a real firearm. So if you can work through, when you're using a real firearm on a set, basic rules, and then specifically for introduction of that on the set, handling of it, and then giving it to an actor.
Sure. Well, Chris, you touched on a really good point right out of the bat, is the fact that these are real weapons, and the lack of education a lot of times on pinpoint the lower budget or non-union shows, but it happens, cross-platform, even on the larger shows. A lot of people just don't understand or have not been properly trained with what they're dealing with or safety in general for firearms. So the first thing to establish is, yes, they are real firearms. There's only two types on a movie set, and that is a prop gun, a true prop gun, which means it is a non-functional, completely inert, cannot fire a round of any sort, blank, etc. And what we refer to as sling reelies, which is a real firearm. Now, you can have a rudimentary one, which is very simple to operate, like a single action army, which is what they used on Rust, or you can have a very complex, fully automatic weapon, which requires a special type of weapon. It requires a special type of modification to it to make it work, and obviously trained personnel to make sure it's done safely. So that's one thing to establish right out of the bat. And a lot of productions just don't understand that. Recently, a stunt performer, friend of mine who works in a lot of shows, called me, and he said that even after this Rust incident, the show that he's working on, which is a larger tier movie, decided that they were not going to use blanks. Okay, they're not going to fire blanks at all on the set. So they decided to 86 the armorer's position entirely and only let a prop master work the weapons. What they failed to understand was the prop master now doesn't even have an armorer, and they're still using live weapons. Just because you're not using blanks doesn't change the safety of it. In fact, you just made a bad situation worse. As far as the safety rules, whether you're a tier 1 operations group or whether you're an enthusiast at a gun range, the safety rules are the same. The basic 4 fundamental safety rules set forth by Colonel Cooper, which was the father of the modern handgun technique, and Cooper set forth the rules. And the rules are, number 1, treat all weapons as they are loaded always. It doesn't matter, it may sound a little cliche, but that's the way you treat them. Every one of them you treat as if they're loaded and ready to fire. Number 2, you never put your finger on that trigger until you're ready to discharge that weapon. Number 3, never let the muzzle of the weapon point or cover anything that you're not willing to destroy. And lastly, and this really doesn't or shouldn't, I should say, apply to a movie set, is be aware of what's in front of, behind, and on all sides of your targets, because bullets pass through things. Obviously, on a movie set, you should never have any round with a projectile in it. So really, the first 3 are the ones that in the way that it should operate are the only ones that are applicable there. So you follow those safety rules regardless of who you are, and it's cross-platform across all industries. On a movie set, I also saw where I think it was maybe some of Baldwin's camp released a statement saying that they were going to continue on with the movie, and they were going to continue on. He was going to be the lead actor, etc. And I was on an interview, and the host asked me, she said, what do you think about these new protocols, these new safety protocols? They're going to put industry people that are trained on set, and they're going to put safety guidelines in place. And I said, I really don't understand that entire line of statements, because those safety guidelines are already in place. They're in place for any production that wants to follow them, and they are, pretty well established in the industry. So it all boils down to a rule is only as good as the people that are willing to follow it or to take the time to understand it. Would you want me to, I can get into the weeds a little bit more when it comes to actual operation on set, or with the way that a safety and handling should happen?
Yeah, I think that on those rules 1 through 3, I could see some redundancy built into the rule, because even if you violated rule 1 and didn't check it or make sure somebody checked it for you, and it actually turns out that you have in fact a loaded firearm, if you don't have your finger on the trigger, it cannot discharge. And if you're not pointing it at somebody, if it did go off and you did have your finger on the trigger, it wouldn't shoot the person. So there's some redundancy involved there. Now, if you can walk us through just again briefly, because some folks have never been on a film production. Some folks would say, look, I mean, it's a long day. It's very tight controls here. They don't have time to go do all these safety checks. I've heard some people say that would just be too much time. Could you just walk us through, like, if you were handling, as the armorer and handing it to an actor, how quickly you could actually go through to verify the safety of the condition of that firearm?
Well, to that point, I would say this, that's why you hire professionals, and that's why everyone understands and follows the rules and whatnot. Now, obviously, as far as I try to lens this, and I have lensed this, not just from the perspective of an armorer or a crew member, but also from a producer standpoint, and the financial difficulties and time restraints and everything you have to deal with there. And everyone's, like you said, try to be empathetic to everyone. But no matter what, that's why all of these procedures are put in place. On a movie set, obviously it's different than if you're in the real world training scenario, and the safety in many ways is just as stringent, if not more, because there's more people checking. In other words, if you start your day out, first of all, you need to get these firearms from a reputable source. They need to come from a prop house that knows how to maintain them, that sends them through ATF channels to and from a trained prop master, somebody who understands firearms and safety and can control these things properly. Secondly, the next line is your armorer. You have an armorer that is trained, that understands, that has the experience to be able to handle these things safety, and has some background to handle a large production with a lot of moving parts, a lot of firearms, a lot of personalities that you might have to deal with. And that doesn't mean just an actor or a producer. It means that you're the last one of the lines of defense of safety there. And if things are going wrong, that's your job and your duty to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. We need to do this, that, or the other. But after you have those two pieces in place, you have a prop master that understands and understands weapons and safety, and you have an armorer that does so as well. And then it's just a chain of custody. You have these weapons, you keep them in a safe and secure location. You segregate, ammunition, blank ammunition from any dummy ammunition. The firearms are locked and kept as a custodian of those firearms, are kept in a locked and safe place at all times. And then I'm skipping forward of a lot. It's a lot on a movie set, because another thing that you have to do as an armorer is understand how to work with an active movie set. You have to understand that we're making a movie here, and there's a lot of different moving parts there, and you'd have to seamlessly work with that. So a soft-handed approach is a good thing. You're not out at boot camp training a bunch of special ops personnel or whatnot. You have to understand how to work with that group and give them the safety they need, with understanding that there's a lot of other things going on to make this film as well. To that point, once you get the weapon and have it out, and let's just say it's just a very simple, single weapon that's being used on set, single, round that's being discharged, then you take it out to the set, and then there's a safety protocol there where you have to clear this weapon with personnel on set that is using it. Your first AD, your DP, your actors, your director, whomever is on set and is going to be in direct proximity to this weapon system. And also the personnel on set, such as your actor and your performers and whatnot. I've worked with a lot of them, and they too understand what is expected and what's not expected. There are certain guidelines and responsibilities, just like getting behind a wheel of a vehicle. The minute you get behind that wheel, you have to do the following things, because those are things that are going to keep you and the public safe. Same thing when it goes for handling a weapon. You put a weapon in your hand and you accept responsibility of that weapon, and the armorer is also there to make sure that all the guidelines are followed, and together you work, as they say in the safety bulletins throughout the day that are given on set, especially when firearms are going to be discharged, as safety is everyone's responsibility.
Okay. And we got some good questions coming in. We're definitely going to hit these as we're going through. And I want to transition now to Heather and talk about, the safety bulletin and contract services. And so for folks that aren't familiar with contract services, who are they? What is that? Is it industry wide? What is the purpose of that bulletin? And maybe if you can, kind of start there to open up that line of discussion.
Sure. So the IATSE, the labor union that represents the film crews, they negotiate an agreement with a group of studios, the AMPTP, and in that agreement, they agree that the producers will, and anybody else who signs on to those agreements, make the same agreements, that they will establish the Contract Training Service Trust Fund, which these studios fund. And within that, there will be a industry-wide safety management committee that's made up of members from the studios and from the labor unions, including SAG-AFTRA and the IATSE. And they come up with safety bulletins, and they're posted. And safety bulletin 1 and 2 deal with firearms safety. Priority is, those are the two hottest safety issues that they put out. They put out these safety bulletins. They're not requirements. I believe they are industry standard. Most of the time, when there is a firearm on set, they're attached to the call sheet. But the studios, again, they choose to do this. Local 600 has promoted that the safety bulletins 1 and 2 should be requirements of their contract. They're not. They're guidelines that most studios adhere to. I would say that they are industry standard. Our members know what they are. They expect to see, the safety bulletin attached to the call sheet if there's firearms on set, and they expect the producers to be following those. And while Rust was a low budget project, it was under our low budget agreement. It was a union covered project that our members were working on. They had it, according to the State of New Mexico Environmental Department Occupation and Safety Bureau's investigation, they had adopted those standards. I don't know exactly how they had adopted the Safety Bulletin 1, but I assume it was on the back of the call sheet, and that people were aware of it, but that same investigation found that it was not followed.
Now, in the CS Safety Bulletin number 1, it refers to, I believe, the producer being ultimately responsible for the safety on the set, which then can delegate that down to a prop master if a firearm's involved, and the prop master can delegate down to an armorer. Alec has a producer credit on this film. And, so is that like a real producer, or is that just in name only? How do you see that fitting into this story?
So I don't know, of course, I don't know the inner workings of how the company was created. I have read that report from the state of New Mexico. They stated that there was an on-set producer who was in charge that day, and they did not charge. He was not charged. That individual was not, or I guess nobody's been charged, is what Richard's going to remind us that. But I haven't heard anything about charges against that producer who was overall responsible. But all of our collective bargaining agreements, the low budget agreement and our basic agreement, all of them say the employer is responsible for safety, and that is, that has to be where it starts and ends. And what is, if he's the employer, I think that's, that's part of responsibility. I don't believe that's what the charges that were announced are about. I don't think they talk about his production responsibility. I know that I saw the complaint that was filed by the family of Halyna Hutchins. I saw the complaint that they filed, and they named everyone under the sun. It was a big caption on that complaint. And I think that's, the company is responsible, and it's hard, these single project companies.
So
they're holding
Richard,
them accountable. Whoever's responsible, there has to be a responsible party, obviously, who's the employer.
Sure. And we have this distinction, obviously, between the civil liability for payment of damages and then the criminal responsibility. And as Heather's noting that even though, Richard, Alec had some kind of producer credit on this film, no producers were charged or charges were not announced against any producers. So does that indicate to you that the DA in New Mexico is focusing not on him as a producer, but more as the person handling the firearm?
That's the way I see it. I mean, I looked at that report also that was put out of New Mexico, and they basically refer to Baldwin's responsibilities as producer was more of fundraising and hiring. There were other people that were named as overseeing what went on the set. And I think we're all kind of aware that, you know, high-end actors get producer credit because they get some back-end money, but they're really not doing the day-to-day on the set. So I don't believe that they're going forward on that theory. I think they are going forward on the theory that he was the one who handled the gun and it went off, and they are saying that it was beyond simple negligence. But, you know, criminal negligence is a much higher standard. It's a, you know, willful disregard. And he has to have a subjective awareness that what he's doing is dangerous to human life. And I can touch upon my feelings as we go on a little further. You guys have heard it already. But, you know, that's really where this is going to go is, you know, what did he know and what he could have done to maybe prevent this from occurring. I think that's really the, you know, what they're saying is, I think they went through in their press conference, there are 4 people that handled, any one of the 4 could have, if they did something different, this would not have happened. But again, when I hear that, I'm not sure that's enough for my mind that there's going to be a conviction that this is criminal negligence.
Sure, and we're going to build that out. And I'm wondering on these industry guidelines or the safety bulletin, Richard, that you know, so in a prosecution for something like this, will the DA be able to show the jury this safety bulletin 1 and saying that this kind of sets the standard or does set the standard for safety on a film set?
I believe it will. I believe they will. I mean, there may be some litigation over it, but I think especially if it was adopted, as it's been mentioned, when this on this particular production, they adopted these rules, then I believe, yes, the DA is going to be able to put that in. And also they're going to put in expert testimony, maybe Bryan, who's going to talk about what should have happened and how things, you know, are different and the expectation, because it's really going to come down to this, you know, what subjectively should have Alec Baldwin and Ms. Hutchins, you know, the armor, you know, what were their responsibilities? Now, these bulletins, you know, that have so many levels of responsibility, you know, that can also help in a defense, you know, if you're saying, well, somebody else messed up here, and not everyone in that chain has been charged. So again, there's some fascinating angles to this.
Sure. And before we go into the meat here of, Bryan, I want to ask you a question before we go into the meat of what we think happened or what we're told have happened on Rust. We had a great question about the impact of COVID rules on, you know, the interactions between the armor and the actor, you know, with distancing and all this stuff. So I don't know, you know, from your perspective, did that could have possibly made it more difficult to have the safety measures in place because of distancing requirements due to COVID?
First of all, that was an excellent question. I was reading in the chat. I was wanting to touch base on it. So thanks, Chris. That was a question that has actually 2 tiers to it. The first tier is, and I've said this for quite some time, you know, there's been a lot of corners cut in filming. Each time a production makes their show cheaper and faster, then the studio wants the next one cheaper and faster, et cetera, et cetera. I think all of you are, in this industry understand that. And there's some validity to the financial side of it, obviously. But unfortunately and ironically, where a lot of the corners are cut are in the area of safety. think we discussed the other day, last week, when we were all speaking on the psychology of that. Maybe the persons that are in charge of the hiring process understand wardrobe and locations and craft services. Maybe they don't understand firearm safety and what it takes to, to interact in that, and what, stunts, special effects, etc. So a lot of the times you would dismiss what you don't understand, and those areas that are actually the three places that someone can actually lose their life if they're not done properly on a set, are actually, the corners are cut there. So you're hiring prop masters that are unskilled, and then hiring an armorer and saying, well, if you want this job as an armorer here, you're also going to have to work as a props person as well. And then when the props department, which always gets behind on every show, when the props department gets behind because they're overwhelmed, then it's like, why aren't you helping props more? Now your safety starts degrading over where you were supposed to be, and it's either that or you lose your job entirely. This was bad before COVID. If you think it was bad before COVID, see what a movie is like now, with all of the financial burden that movies have now for all of the COVID. And I'm not going to fall on one side of the fence on whether I agree or disagree with the COVID protocol, but what I will say, from a matter of factual monies, dollars and cents, it is a lot more of an impact on money that productions are having to pay. And trust me, we just produced one and it was expensive. And now those same places are looking to cut even more corners. And guess where they're going to go? Back to square one. They're going to cut them where they already were cutting them. You may have 4 or 5 hair and makeup personnel on a show, which I have nothing against hair and makeup, and they are very, very important to us, the nature of finishing a movie. However, you may only have 2 or 3 actors, 4 or 5 hair and makeup personnel, and then you may have 80 guns firing on that movie, some of which complex machine guns, and 1 armorer if you're lucky. So yeah, there's a lot of corners cut there, and it is an impact for COVID just on a dollars and cents. And then lastly, when it comes to directly to your question about whether COVID affects the amount of people on a set, yes, I mean, there's a limitation to area and square footage and all of these things. The union regs I've read many, many times, and the complexity of them and what they expect. However, I will say this: if you've got a set, and let's say hypothetically here, not to speak on any specific things, but hypothetically, there's, let's say, between 14 and 16 people you can put inside of the square foot of one area that you're filming in, and every single person in that room, whether it's lighting, grip, hair and makeup, wardrobe, everybody in there is present except for the one person that's involved and directly responsible, along with the people present as well, for safety, and they're omitted. So yeah, it can work against you, but you have to manage properly and get the right people in the right room.
So Heather, I want to transition to you on this, because like particularly with Rust, it's a church scene. It seems like a very small building. You have a lot of people who need to be in there to make that scene happen. Do you think that there's industry rules that were in effect due to COVID that might have limited safety, or is this something that's surmountable?
I have not heard any. I wouldn't say that there's COVID safety protocols. I don't call them the union regs that Bryan refers to them as. They're agreed on by the
Right.
employers and the producer and the unions to keep the workers safe, right? So these are agreed upon guidelines that we've been working off, and they are work, and they're onerous on our members. Nobody wants to be working carrying heavy equipment in a KN95 mask in the heat and so forth. So but I don't know. And I don't even know, this could be I don't know what protocols they were following at that time. There's different ones, and I just haven't looked into that. And I haven't heard much discussion that it was the safety protocols that impacted anything that was going on. I have heard things, I've read articles about, and spoken to people about, about cutting corners, about, and of course every production is on a budget and they're on a schedule, and that is where safety goes, and that's where you have to be most careful. That's when long hours start to make people, and they were working long hours on this project, as I believe, I don't know if it was the day before, but in that time frame there had been long hours, there had been long commutes on that project. So I don't think that I don't know anything about the COVID safety protocols impacting it. I know that they're hard. I know that they, like I said, our members are carrying heavy equipment with KN95 masks in hot rooms, and it's hard. But you know, they are things that are agreed upon to keep members safe. So I don't know if they impacted this project or not.
So now I want to kind of walk through some of the things that I've read about the incident and leading up to it, and just kind of throw that out there for each of you and any of you that want to react to it or disagree with it. But I just kind of want to build this foundation so we can understand at least what's been reported has happened. So before the shooting, it was reported that there was 2 other incidents where a firearm was used on the set and that it discharged in a manner that was not planned. And but we don't know if Alec was ever informed of that. So I guess right there, if you have an incident like that occurring, would it not normally go up to the highest levels of the production to saying, like, wow, we had a firearm discharge in a way that was not intended? I think somebody might even got their foot injured in one of them. You know, is that something that you would expect would ordinarily be elevated to the highest levels and saying, wow, we really need to be doing a better job in our safety briefings and protocols for safety? Anyone want to touch that one?
If you don't mind, I'll speak on that, guys. So there's obviously in Chris, you follow me on this, you know, as your background would, you know, obviously you've had education and training in this. You know, there's 2 types of firearms negligence. There's NDs and ADs, negligent discharges and accidental discharges. Very, very, very rarely is there truly an accidental discharge, which would be a firearm malfunction, some, you know, very unusual circumstance. Almost all, and I mean 99+% of the time, it's a negligent discharge, operator error, something that was wrong. Now, when an armorer gives off a weapon to a stunt performer, right, or an actor, and they do something improper with it right there, there's really nothing the armorer, if they've done their job and they've trained, educated, instructed, and then hand off the weapon, and then the stunt performer, let's just say it's a stunt performer, accidentally discharges or has a negligent discharge, that's nothing that they could control at that point. That is on the stunt performer. Now, in what you're speaking of on Rust, what you don't do, and I can speak on this, you don't hand off a weapon loaded to someone and let them leave with it or hold it loaded. No matter how many times, and trust me on this one, you have the first AD or the director look at the armor, look at the props and say, hey, hand that gun off, we're about to roll. Unless I hear sound speed, unless I know, and from experience, that they are about to film that scene. In other words, hair and makeup's not going to make an appearance. They're not going to have to change camera setup. They're not, you know, didn't lose video on something, et cetera, et cetera. I hand the weapon off at the very last moment that I can to get on camera, and it's prepared and it's hot, and we call it out and do everything that we need to do at that moment. If you hand off a weapon that's loaded to a stunt performer who, no matter what they may say, will tell you they understand safety, but may not, and they go away with it into, let's say, a actor holding area and discharge it, well, that's an armor issue right there. You now, the stunt performer may have had an ND, but obviously it was the armorer that did it as well. So when that happens, generally on a set, there's usually a safety form filled out, and they'll fill out an incident report and say, hey, this occurred at this particular time, and this is what happened, and here's the people present.
Now, I also heard, or we heard, that firearms were being used for target practice on, you know, the filming location, you know, on off time, and which obviously would involve the use of live rounds on the set. Now, I understand from the safety bulletin that there is never to be a live round on the set. So does that compute to, you know, how shocking, I guess, is that to everyone here that if there was a actual live round or target practice being used, if true?
It's shocking. It should have been reported, investigated, shut down. I don't like that if there's live ammunition, there shouldn't be people working there.
I will just comment on that I obviously saw those reports in the first, you know, month or so after this, but looking at the state of New Mexico, the occupational health and safety, they don't mention that at all. So I wonder if that was more rumor, and if it was or was not true. But it's going to be, when we get more to the criminal aspect of it, I think it's an important fact, because, if somebody has no reason to believe there's live ammo on the set, then the standard that you're putting on them may be a little different than if there is live ammo on the set.
Yeah, and I think, Richard, that's an excellent point. And it's in a jury trial, the information that the jury receives is very controlled because, when we hear and as we're going to go through the horrific safety violations on this set, it's really relevant only to what Alec knew, and there's going to be some issues of proof on whether he was aware of these things or perhaps should have been aware of it. Bryan.
Yes, I mean, the most terrifying thing that you can have on any production when it comes to handling firearms is to discover a live round somewhere. And there is no virgin ever in any atmosphere of a movie set that there should be a live round. I will say this, not commenting directly on anything to do with the case, but I will say this: if there were to be live training occurred in any way, shape, form, or fashion, that has to be separated with the utmost safety. In real world training, sometimes you use what's called UTM, or universal training munitions. It's basically a wax bullet fires out of the weapon systems and use it, for force on force training. In those particular circumstances, the level of checks that you go through to make sure that there are no live ammunition on anyone's persons, inside the vehicles, anywhere around is just, it's extensive, to say the very least. So if there were going to be live rounds used to train an actor, and sometimes actors do request and see what the weapon functions like. We did that in the past. That's one of the realism things that Dark 30 did, but we would take them out to a military base on an off day, schedule it with production. It is on generally the call sheets. They know they're doing it on the day that you're not filming. You never use the same weapon systems that you're using on a movie. You don't even use the same vehicles and travel in the same vehicles. And that may sound redundant, but safety is never redundant.
Okay. So now we have a question, and this leads into the next kind of fact that I want to introduce is the armor, or the qualifications or lack of qualifications of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed as the armor. And it's a question for Bryan and Heather. So first of all, it's what I'm told, or what we're told is that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, her father is a very experienced and well-respected armorer, but Hannah was really a newbie, didn't have much of any experience, might have been her first production where she actually served as an armorer. And so one question to you, Bryan, is, what are the qualifications to be an armorer? And then Heather, on the expectations from your side of the industry side, the guild side, is it just, we just rely on the producer to select a qualified person, or is there some greater expectation of what those qualifications are? So let's start with Bryan on what does it take to be an armorer? Well,
I'd back up one step in that chain, and the one step that I would back up to is the prop master. Generally, the prop master, aside from one show that I worked on where I had my own department, I worked with and under a prop master as an armorer. And a prop master generally gets their firearms from a prop house. Now, the prop house handles the firearms and has an ATF license to do so. Well, the prop house gets their rentals from the prop master generally. That's how they make their money. So it's in the prop house's best interest to find prop masters that they can put on their ATF licensing. When they put those prop masters on their ATF license, then they can ship guns directly to them. And then from that point, the prop master then picks an armorer to handle those weapons, which sometimes is on the same license as well. So you see there's a motivation along that entire chain to give someone the ability to handle these things with or without the proper training, because it, at the end of the day, is a money issue. Now, to be an armorer professionally, and I hate to be the one to say this here, there are really no universal guidelines across the United States. A couple isolated regions have more guidelines and more things in place, but in the South down here, in Louisiana, Mississippi, all over the area, Georgia, there are no hard, fast rules about what you need to be, or what you need to have certification-wise to be an armorer, which is one of the things that I have been an advocate for now going on years, which I've spoke to good friends in the union that agree with me. I've spoke to state level film commissioners. Mississippi has actually started to implement some safety regulations But since they don't legislate, all they can do is give a recommendation. And since, like Heather said, these are just guidelines, you have to have something there enforcing the guidelines. So I would love to tell you that there is a series of training and certifications that are required to be an armorer and work on any set and be in charge of people's safety. Unfortunately, I can't.
Okay. So
And
Heather,
I think I don't know of any, there may be some that I'm not aware of, but I don't know that there are any requirements, that an employer has on what qualifications they have. I know it's hard as heck for a camera assistant to get work without lots of experience in the industry. So I would just expect those standards to be upheld by the employer also. I mean, when you hire professionals to make your movie, they only want professionals who are going to do it right on the first try. So I would expect the same standard, but I don't know if there is another one.
Heather, that was an excellent point there. And that's exactly, imagine me coming into this industry, over a decade ago. And that's why we started Dark 30 initially, because one of my film clients said, hey, there's no one here really that has a background of safety to teach. And, imagine my shock. Like you said, you need to handle anything with a camera or lighting. There's tons of certifications and things that you need and experience, and you vet them out properly. There just isn't existing with one of the most dangerous things on a movie set. I recently had a line producer call me, and quick story, she wanted me to bid for a job. I did bid the job, and then they came back, and her boss, the main producer, said they were going a different direction. And it was an individual out of Alabama. Once I called the union and I checked in on it, he had worked as a extra on 2 shows, and then the next thing you know, he was an armorer, and he was, and I quote, bringing his own guns from his house to do the show, and his price was cheap enough that they hired him. And it's just a miracle no one got harmed on that set, because there was no one in the hiring process that understood what this shouldn't have happened, and no one there to stop or oversee the fact that it did happen.
So Heather, any knowledge that you have of the industry trying to tighten up some of this because of the danger, the inherent danger involved of using a firearm on a set, for the industry to be having some requirements for the armorer or prop master on set?
Our union has advocated for legislation that would require an on-set safety supervisor, an independent, not hired directly by the company, which is something that they have, I believe, in Australia and New Zealand. We proposed legislation. Nothing's been passed at this time, but it's something we've advocated. I'm not aware, again, we've also advocated for, this happened after our last negotiations, but we've advocated for safety bulletins 1 and 2 to be required, right? So that they would be requirements for productions. And we put out a whole host of other requests, but nothing, I don't know of any requirements that have gone into place since then.
So I'll just comment just on the union issue, on kind of a different side of it, and that SAG came out when these charges were announced and really said, you can't hold the actor liable. This is not an actor issue. So there are competing sides here. And, SAG took a very strong position, like you can't, our actors are the last one to get this weapon, and you can't hold them to a higher standard.
Right, and I won't say, I don't think I'm competing with that. Their statement was very interesting, in their point being it's the employer's responsibility and a qualified armor. And they suggested they didn't have that there. I don't remember the exact words of that statement, but that the actor's there to act and people are there to do the job they're hired to do. And I know that they said the employer, and I believe the armorer, they need a professional armorer, and which is implying they did not have one.
Well, and I was reading one of the chat, Edwin asked that same question you guys are touching on right now. And, on the converse side of that, there is a point to say that if someone takes a dangerous weapon in their hand, if they hold a firearm in their hand, they're responsible enough, or should be responsible enough, to know what you can and cannot do with that. And I think a good analogy of that would be, I said, each state has highway patrol. and they're in charge of enforcing the rules of the road, and they're there to make sure that, you know, they're not broken. But that doesn't mean you can get behind the wheel of a car and drive 100 miles an hour and run stop signs. You know what you can and cannot do behind that wheel of that car, and you have to take safety as a paramount concern. You can't say, well, I'm going to drive 150 miles an hour because there's no highway patrolman here, or the highway patrolman, you know, isn't anywhere to be found. You have to take responsibility, and there is responsibility to be had there, especially in a particular circumstance where you have an actor who has, by his own admission, said that he was an expert, very well trained and knowledgeable of what should and should not happen with a firearm on set, and, you know, who should be handling that firearm, etc. So just as a converse side of that coin, you know, there is that responsibility.
I want to
And
introduce.
that's not discounting the producer side of that.
Richard? Or-
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, no, you know, it's interesting. I'm looking at one of the questions here also. And, you know, you're saying what Alec Baldwin knew or didn't know. Well, as a defense lawyer, first of all, and I got a funny email from somebody on Friday, they were referring me a case, and I sent a quick email back and said, make sure the client knows not to say anything, you know, until they talk to me. And he emailed back, oh, the Alec Baldwin rule, which again, you know, we have client control as lawyers. We can only suggest things to our clients. But no, I don't think Alec Baldwin helped himself by doing all these interviews and making statements and taking positions and saying he never pulled the trigger. I mean, part of me kind of pulling the trigger almost is irrelevant, even if he had, you know, if I wish he would have kept his mouth shut, but even if he did, you know, the question is, again, we come back to how did the live round end up there in the first place? I mean, normally you would think the worst thing that can happen on a movie set is, you know, there's a real weapon, but there's blanks and it's going to, you know, go off someone, scare them, you know, hurt their ears, you know, maybe there's a burn or something. That's probably what, you know, you talk about reasonable expectations of a shooting on a moving set. That's kind of the reasonable expectation, not a live round. And that's where I think the criminal negligence part of this case is going to fall apart, because, you know, it's what he knew. And, you know, was it a willful disregard for human life? And of course, we all know it was, you know, he didn't intend to kill somebody and didn't think he was going to, even if this went as bad. You know, going into a movie set, the worst case scenario is, you know, even the 2 discharges that happened earlier, you know, one was they were blanks. So, I mean, it's noise, it's scary, it's sound, but it's not as if it caused damage. And I understand Bryan's position, and you know, Chris, you know, you've been around guns long enough, you understand a gun is always dangerous, and you treat it, you know, it's like getting behind the wheel of a car. You know the car is dangerous as soon as you enter a road where there's individuals. But a gun, you know, kids all play with toy guns, and they have cap guns, and they make noise, and, you know, it's awful that they point it and they play, and that's all fine. Well, that's kind of what a movie set in a lot of people's mind is. It's all kind of make believe, and no one really thinks there's going to be a live round. And how you make that leap, I think you have to make that leap to really get criminal liability on Baldwin. You know, I think from the Gutierrez standpoint, the armor, I find it a little interesting that she was trying to do her job. You look at some of the emails, she kept complaining. They wanted her to do other things. You only have 8 days paid as an armor, and then the rest of the time you're working on the prop team. And she was complaining about that. That may play into a defense that she has. Yes, should she have walked off at that point? Some people, I think Bryan would probably say yes to that. You're not going by the safety, but maybe things would have been worse if she walked off. And maybe she's tried to stick around to do the best she could. So again, you know, we can think about defenses for all these cases. I mean, I would expect these are going to be separate trials, because if I'm on, you know, Gutierrez's team, we know Baldwin's going to blame everybody else. Everyone who touched that weapon prior to him getting it, including her. So, you know, there may be a conflict. And of course, the prosecution wants everybody there just throwing mud. But I think you're going to see 2 separate trials if she even goes. I mean, again, we talked earlier when the group talked. I've not seen a case in 35 years where a prosecutor comes and announces, I'm going to file charges. You know, that was on the 19th. Apparently, they're going to file them tomorrow. Someone was telling me earlier today, but they haven't filed charges yet. Just to say I'm about to file charges, that's weird. And when you announce it, and in part of your announcement is even A-list actors are not safe, it kind of seems like you're targeting somebody. And then you have a special prosecutor who's a former prosecutor, got wonderful credentials as a prosecutor, but now she's a legislator and a very, looking at her Facebook, and I looked at some of her social media, she's right-wing, she's a Republican. These are the people who hate Alec Baldwin, who used to go on SNL and do all the Trump, imitations. And, so all of a sudden now, there's a appearance of a bias, and why they just couldn't have used a career prosecutor. You had to bring somebody special in that appears to have a bias. I have a lot of questions. So,
Yeah.
I'll stop
So
right here.
and those are all great questions. Now, I want to introduce another kind of fact here, as building this up. We have the first assistant director, David Halls, who, and I understand from the chain of command, custody of this firearm, it would go from the prop house to the prop master, if there's an armor, to the armor, and then to the hand of the actor. It would never go, Bryan, to a first assistant director. That's correct? Or?
That is correct. And it's funny. I've worked with some really, the first assistant director is a heart and soul of keeping a movie set running. And, they're a very important position. And I was just recently working with a very good prop master. It was a young, first assistant director, first AD. It was a younger gentleman, but boy, was he good at his job. And it was funny because we were doing this big scene with a bunch of Marines at a base camp. And one of the individual people on the set, I don't know who it was, one of the producers, I'm not exactly sure who they were exactly, but they came up and they were telling everybody to speed up, go faster, go faster, go faster. And which isn't uncommon. I'm not throwing shade there. It's just normal. We were trying to get through the day. And they asked the first assistant director to help assist me and my crew, my staff, to get all of these 20 plus M16s ready to go, which was a lot, right? And the first thing that he did is he turned around, he goes, "Oh, absolutely not." He said, I do not handle firearms. I do not put my weapons on firearms. That is the armor and his crew's job. He tells, or they tell, she tells, whomever tells me when and what, if these guns are safe. And then I make sure that we pass it along to the crew. That's a good first AD. That's someone that understands their job. And it's not the fact that you're trying to step on a toe or step on people's toes. It's nothing to do with that. It's the fact that if you start interjecting people in the middle of a chain of safety, then the chain starts breaking down. You need to know exactly, as we said, chain of custody, to whom it went and where it's going, and make sure that everybody in that line checks and make sure it's safe, including the first AD.
And now, I'm just going to mention the first AD, sticking with him for a moment. He's entered a plea here. And he entered a plea to a negligent discharge of a firearm. It looks like he's got a 6-month suspended sentence, so it's no time, and he gets probation. And I just kind of bring that up for people enter pleas for a lot of different reasons, not always because they're guilty. This is an expensive process. We don't know who, Alec Baldwin can afford his defense. He's going to have the best defense. He's got wonderful lawyers. You should listen to him, and I think he's going to be fine. I don't know what Mr. Hall's situation was. He got a no-time deal. He's walking away from this, and he's going to move on with his career. I don't know if he agreed to cooperate, if he's going to be testifying against Mr. Baldwin. None of that's out there yet. But it's just, so we don't know, but we've got somebody who took no time just to put this behind him. And so let's just see where that plays out.
Yeah. Now, I want to build out what happened, at least what's been reported, is that Halyna Hutchins, apparently the gun was stored in a vehicle, I think, in a locked container by the prop master, I think, then somehow gets into the hands of Halyna Hutchins Reed, the armorer. It gets put on a cart where there is a box of what are supposed to be dummy rounds in there. That cart gets brought into the church. Halyna Hutchins Reed says she's called out of the church because she's also doing other unrelated services on this set. And so now we have, number one, an unattended firearm, at least not one that's attended by the prop master or the armorer, on a cart. And the first assistant director, David Halls, who should have never touched the weapon at all, picks it up. And I believe he says he checked it to see if it was safe, and at some point, and then hands it to Alec Baldwin, yells "cold gun," gives it to Alec Baldwin. So stopping right there, again, we've already established David Hall should have never touched the weapon. if he in fact checked it for safety, he would have seen that it was real live cartridges in there and not dummy rounds that are easily distinguishable. And then we've also we're told that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed's not even in the church, or not even in the room when this happens. So I guess the question here for Alec Baldwin on his defense is, like, was he aware, because he's proclaimed to have used firearms so much on the set over his very long career, to know that David Halls was unqualified to determine whether it was safe or not? And did Alec Baldwin knew that that the first AD should have never even handled that weapon? I mean, these are unknowns, I guess, that are going to be coming out. But I mean, we've introduced now a player in here who kind of cowboyed the thing and just grabs it and says, "I declare it safe," and hands it to somebody else.
And tells Alec Baldwin it's safe.
Yeah, that's right. Now, so we get into now, do you ever accept somebody's word that it's safe? In my view, never. And you talked about, like, I have a toy gun here. Like, to me, I mean, obviously, I kind of think this is not going to fire. But I mean, it's ingrained in me that I would never point this. I just don't point this at somebody, and it just ingrained in me. But that's my bias.
Well,
but this was not a little toy gun. This was a real firearm. And so when do we, just out of common sense, so forgetting about being an actor, forgetting about relying on other people or whatever, so-called professionals, just out of our common sense, when do we say, like, hey, I'm not going to take your word for it that it is safe? Would Alec Baldwin have pointed that at one of his children and pulled the trigger on reliance on David Hall's word that it was safe? Would he have put it to his own head and pulled the trigger on reliance, or say, hey, actually, I want to check that first? Because it was not opened up. And again, and the question to Bryan, how long would it have taken to demonstrate, physically and visually demonstrate to Alec Baldwin by the armor or any qualified person that this was safe?
A bunch of good points that you just made. Well, number one, I want to point out is what you're talking about is mitigation. Human error happens, things happen, but if you follow safety rules, those 4 safety rules are meant to mitigate damage if you make a mistake. In other words, you accidentally let a weapon go off and you're not pointing it in an unsafe direction, you have mitigated the amount of damage that weapon will do and that round will do. So those are what's important. And like you said, they're ingrained in anyone that understands or says they understand firearm safety. How long would it have taken? Seconds. In other words, if anything changes ever, if I walk out on a movie set and let's just say, let's fast forward the button, and I've cleared everything and everyone's good to go, and I hand the weapon off and I'm standing there watching the entire scene unfold, right? And nothing changes and everyone's standing there. They can continue on and filming it as many times as they want to unless things change. If anything changes, in other words, they cut, I immediately take possession of it back, or the wants to give it back me, or it gets moved, or they move room, everything means let's start all over again. Again, you can't be too redundant with safety. So to check it, it would be so simple as to, on that type of weapon, to open the cylinder, you would dump the rounds out, and assuming that they were supposed to be dummy rounds in that weapon. In other words, rounds that appear to be live but are not, okay, for close camera work. Meaning that they were looking straight down the weapon into the front of the cylinder. So if you had blanks in there or nothing in there, you would see the weapon unloaded. So you put dummy rounds in there. You would dump those rounds out. You would each individually inspect them by shaking them, and you can visually and physically hear the rattle and see that the round has certain things on it that means that it's a dummy, and you would keep your dummy separate, but that's another entire matter separate from this. Then you would show your first AD, you would show Alec Baldwin, you would show your actor, you would show your DP, whomever wants to. Sometimes some of these people say, no, I'm good, you showed it to me, I insist, I'm going to show it to you. If the actors insist on not seeing it, then I would say, okay, then I'm going to show it to another person outside of that chain. So I'm going to make up for your intentionally not wanting to look at this by showing it to a secondary person outside of that chain. And then I'm going to continue to educate and force that safety on that situation in that scenario right there. 15 seconds is what it takes to show clear down the muzzle and the rounds are good.
And I got to think there'll be testimony about, maybe armorers or prop masters on other sets where Alec Baldwin had handled a firearm into saying, yes, we did that every time.
All right.
and then compare here where it wasn't done.
Well, I mean, and again, we just recently did a show with the two very well-known, very professional actors, and the older gentleman insisted that I check it 2 or 3 times and opened it up and wanted me to repetitively show it. And then the younger actor took the weapon, looked at it, opened it up himself, looked at it, cleared it, put it back together and said, okay, it's clear. And that's just basically common practice on a movie set for anybody that understands what should.
I also think that there's something to this. I mean, I agree with all of this. You know, I've taken firearms training, and so Chris, I mean, I told you said I was in the military, so that's where so there's rules about things you would do with a weapon that Bryan stated, the very basic rules. Those resonate with me, and the things you said, Chris. But I think SAG-AFTRA's point that, look, the actor shows up, they're not trained on this. The production has this responsibility to have somebody professional come in and say, this is what we're going to do, and have that armorer who follows the protocols. So it's not, you're sort of putting it on the actor there. And I think that the production has to take the responsibility to do it right. And they, here it sounds like Hall's admits he didn't do it right.
I'm just going to add with using that Baldwin's been trained, he's used guns on so many sets. I mean, I think every one of those, the more time he's done that, the more times there's been no accidents, everything's been safe, everything's been done right. That kind of goes to what his expectations are. I expect people to be professional. I hired professionals. Somebody handed it to him, maybe not the person who normally does, but tells him it's a cold weapon. Again, are you going to get to the point where it's such a willful disregard that it's criminal negligence? It's going to be difficult.
Well, to that point, I would say this: if you have worked on all of those movie sets, and like I said, again, say that you're very familiar with the weapons and handling, and you see a series of events, they already lost their camera crew, right? And they're already operating on a skeleton crew. There's been a host of safety issues. And again, I'm not getting into the particulars, but trust me, it was more than one thing. It was a host of just repetitive domino effect of safety issues. And then at some point in time, you get to a moment that you say to yourself, I know this isn't being done right. I know this is unsafe, and I know this isn't going right. So I have a choice at this point to either say, hey, let's tap the brakes, let's fix whatever problems are going on here, and let's not move on. Or you decide at that point to say, I don't want to spend any more money on an extra day of filming on this production, or I don't want to lose my job or my career, or I don't want this entire thing to cost me any more money out of my own pocket. And that, at that point, is where, in my opinion, it goes from a civil issue to a criminal negligent point. And there were, and continue to be, a lot of compounding problems that anyone that had anything more experienced than one movie under their belt would have known this is not going right, and this is definitely unsafe, and I should say, let's stop for a moment.
But I just want to say that it is very hard for workers, especially on a film set, to speak up. After this incident, we've had lots of conversations with our members about concerted activity and when they're protected, when they take action for a safety issue. But it is hard. You are under pressure. You are trying to make, you have a budget, you have a timeline, and you're trying to get it done. And I think it's really hard to expect individuals to stop and say, hey, I think we have a safety issue here. I don't think we followed the rule. And so that's why it has to be done professionally from the top, because I think it's really hard to expect workers to stop what they're doing and say, hey, I think we should, get together and do some concerted activity so that we protect our jobs and we have a safer environment. It's really hard.
Heather,
I think that's kind of where Gutierrez-Reed fell into. I mean, with Baldwin, I think you're an actor. It's kind of like being an athlete. You're in the middle of filming. He's in a mode. He's in character. He's practicing his little pointing the weapon. I mean, he's doing that. He's rehearsing. I mean, he's working. Again, no expectation that this thing is going to go off. I think that we can take that side, but I think Gutierrez-Reed, where did that line come where she should have, as you say, Bryan, stepped away? And that's a little bit harder. I mean, again, and I would say, if she stepped away, maybe she felt, and again, she's young, doesn't mean she's not qualified, but she's certainly young and doesn't have the experience. you don't want to walk away from your first job. You want to try to make it right. Hey, they're not all doing everything perfectly, but I'm going to try to fix this. I don't want to be the quitter. And again, I think it's an interesting analysis from her side.
Freelance is very hard. It's job to job. Like you walk away from one and you're not going to get another. It's
Heather, you're exactly right, and that's why I have been pushing. And you're right, from the top down, education, training, and oversight. Education, training, and oversight. If it's not there, if you're incentivized to hire people that aren't trained properly because they're the cheapest people you can hire, do it somewhere other than in safety. Because when you hire it, and the first thing I teach my armors when I send them out to the set, because they have to understand how to liaise with a movie set, and that's one of the main points, But I tell them, I said, if you're not willing to walk away from this job and quit, then don't take it in the first place, because you are taking on a responsibility of people's safety and their well-being and their life. And if you can't say, hey, I've given you every option, soft-handed, to say that this is unsafe and we can't do it this way, but you're continuing on, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to continue on myself. If you're not willing to do that, then don't take the responsibility of safety on, and don't take the job to begin with. Again, it's not like, ordering a wrong shoe size and wardrobe and someone's feet get hurt at the end of the day because they walked in a 9 instead of a 10.5. You actually are in possession of the means to either cause someone to lose their life or not. And this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I think that's it for me. I mean, this is a deadly weapon, and it needs to be treated with that level of respect, and it wasn't. Live rounds being mixed in apparently in this box of ammunition that was supposed to have dummy rounds, and live rounds being introduced. And so all of the work that's done to make sure lighting and camera angle and all that stuff is done correctly to get a beautiful looking shot. But then really no effort being placed on handling a deadly weapon, an actual real gun on set that's being pointed. Now I want to talk about this issue of finger on trigger or not. And in the Alec Baldwin interview, ABC interview, he denied having his finger on the trigger and said that he had cocked it. So, again, this is the toy, but, this firearm was the old Western style 45 long Colt, and on the back there's a hammer, and he says he had cocked that hammer, and there was never going to be a shot fired. He was just pointing the gun for this particular shot. So he drew it, he cocked it, and then he said it went off. Now, Bryan, with this particular type of gun, if you do not have your finger on the trigger, if you have it on the side, like he's apparently claiming it was, and you cock it and release it, just let the hammer fall, assuming the gun's not been modified or damaged, is it even possible, mechanically possible, for the firing pin to hit the primer and the gun to go off in that condition?
Okay, so it being that type of weapon, which is an 1800s era gun, right? When you cock the hammer back, as you're cocking it back, it starts engaging these sears. And just imagine 2 gears, a mechanism, 2 teeth of a gear. When one gear engages, it clicks, and when another, it clicks. And basically, as those mechanisms engage each other, it prevents the hammer from falling forward. And in order to disengage that mechanism, you have to pull the trigger. Now, speaking for the health of the firearm, so to speak, the firearm was tested by the FBI lab, and they exhaustively tested that firearm. I have spoke with them. We've looked at all of this, and they not only did impact test on all sides, they checked the weapon, but they went through a lot of other singular weapons tests to make sure that it was in good operating condition, and it was in absolutely perfect operating condition. In fact, I even made the comment that considering how these guns get worn and used and whatnot, this was an exceptional example of one that was in good working condition. So the weapon wasn't malfunctioning, and it wasn't in bad condition as to cause it to malfunction. If you pull the hammer back just a touch, right, and then it falls forward with force, in other words, a cowboy wearing it in the Old West falls off of a horse and the hammer strikes a rock on the ground, is the only way that that weapon could discharge without having the trigger pulled. And that requires a massive amount of force. In other words, it can't be done just by barely pulling it back. And we're talking 2 or 3 centimeters pulling it back and letting it go. It's just not enough inertia to make it fire. You would need a brick to smash the hammer while holding it in the other hand. So we can move past that. As you're moving the hammer further back, which is what happened here, and you're cocking it, it then begins to engage those mechanisms. And without a trigger press, the mechanisms will not disengage.
Yeah.
So
And that's going to be
your
key.
question, no.
Key for the prosecution to show the condition of the firearm. It had not been altered or damaged. But again, what I'm seeing is a lot of times when people are handed a firearm or they're handling it, a lot of times their finger goes right into the trigger guard like I'm demonstrating. It's just because they just don't know better. They don't have the training to keep it on the side. So my suspicion is that's what's happened. I think in his interview, he was stating like, look, I would never put my finger on the trigger because the scene never called for firing it or simulating firing it. And it was almost as if he would have acted more carefully had he decided to put his finger on the trigger, which again makes no sense to me because you don't handle the firearm at all, unless it's you've checked it or somebody's checked it for you. It's not like there's a different level of safety required in my mind, whether you're going to put your finger on the trigger or not.
Well, he also brought up the point, and I was asking in an interview about the fanning. When you're fanning a weapon, that's an old West movie way of firing it. Basically, you hold the trigger down, depress it fully, and then with your palm of your opposing hand, you just rake the back of the hammer and make it go all the way back, and then just rake it and let it release, and that will fire the weapon and rotate the cylinder. However, that's a nonsensical point a point to be made there because you're still pulling the trigger. It's just a type of firing without pulling the trigger multiple times. You're just holding it down constantly and then fanning it. So that was another point that he brought up that really didn't make mechanical or functional sense, and certainly not safety sense.
Well, he had PR people advising him, I think not lawyers, when he was doing that at those interviews. And I think if they were advising him, he wouldn't have given any statements, because anytime there's a chance for a criminal case, you want as few statements out there as possible. So when you testify, you can, you're clean, and it's easier. Now, if he testifies something differently, they're going to have these interviews, and I think they will be able to introduce them and play them. Okay, they weren't under oath and all of that, but I mean, I think in his mind, somehow he believes he never pulled that trigger. I'm not sure in defending this, because as I made clear, I don't think it would matter, because if the expectation is that there's not a live round in it, then what's the worst thing that can happen is this does go off and somebody doesn't get hurt. So I don't think it would have mattered to his defense, but somehow in his mind, he really doubled down on that. And I'm not sure there was a good reason to do that.
And that,
Chris,
brings...
I'm sorry, Chris. One of the things that I wanted to bring up before you, I think that what Chris said, and that was very good just a moment ago, is would Alec Baldwin have cocked that hammer and put it up to his temple and pulled the trigger if it had been a suicide scene? Would he have insisted that armorer be in that room and that first AD didn't hand it to him and say, hey, this thing's fine, go ahead? Or would he have said, hey, no, this isn't, I shouldn't be taking it from a first AD, and where's my armorer, by the way? And I'm not going to point this weapon directly at somebody, especially in the proximity we're at. It was a very good point. And, I don't know many people that would do that.
Well, maybe you're segueing to what Chris can say. Now, going forward, what's going to happen? And that's,
well, yeah. One thing about, Richard, you're, and I think you're doing the best job that could possible, as a defense attorney. But hey, what's the worst that could happen? And this leads into one of the questions about Brandon Lee, who was killed on the scene, on the set of a movie, and it was supposed to be blanks, and there were blanks. And so it's not just a matter of, hey, at the worst, it was a blank and it would have fired and something like that. In the Brandon Lee incident, there was a obstruction or something in the barrel of the gun that should not have been there. And in my understanding, or maybe it was an improperly manufactured blank, but it actually caused something to go down the muzzle and kill him. So, it I think goes back to the reverence of a deadly weapon. And unfortunately, some people just look at guns as toys, when again, to my mind, it's the same as a stick of dynamite or if I asked you like, hey, let's drive together in a car, I'm going to blindfold you and I will tell you when to brake and turn. Trust me, no one's taken that bet. No rational person has taken that bet. But again, with a gun, and it may be his best defense is instead of what he said on ABC, like, hey, I've been on, I know what I'm doing. He should have said, I am completely ignorant. I'm not an expert. I'm an actor. I'm really good as an actor, but I know nothing about guns. And I don't even know chain of safety and all this. There's a guy, David Halls. He looks very qualified to me. He handed the gun, cold gun. I've never had a gun go off in my whole 40-year history of acting. That would have been pretty good to me. You know, I mean, again, not with my background, but it's just still, he said too much. Okay.
He said too much. Yeah. Go ahead.
Now, and also another comment was about, you know, maybe they're filming at the time, and I don't know, you know, how much of this is actually on film to see his finger actually going on the trigger. You know, do we have that footage that might actually be there? But again, all important questions. Somebody lost their life. Somebody was shot. You know, Alex, like I say, I mean, I think he has to rationalize to live with himself that he didn't do anything wrong because he killed somebody. And it's a very, I mean, it's just devastating thing. Okay, so now I want to move to conclude about what we can learn from this, because we don't want another Halyna Hutchins. We don't want another Brandon Lee incident happening. And so, you know, Heather, you know, what can, I mean, do you see real industry changes being made? We've heard some people say, you know, don't even use a firearm at all. You know, use a simulated weapon and then deal with it in post somehow. I mean, we have the rules. And as Bryan said, if you follow the rules, even if you break one of them, you might still be okay. Here we broke all of them. But I mean, are the rules need to be changed? The way that we do things need to be changed? How do we avoid this?
Well, I think those rules that we have are good rules. But we'd also like an industry pledge not to use firearms, to use replicas whenever you can. And I think most of the time you can. I'm not a producer, but it seems that most of the times that, you know, we talk to our cinematographers and they feel like it's almost always reasonable to use a replica. If you have to use it, make sure you use one that cannot fire live ammunition. So those are things that, you know, we think could be improved. In addition to requiring those safety protocols, not suggesting them, and having an on-set safety supervisor. Again, there would be a third-party person that we think should be an industry standard. But I do think that, but I don't know if people are moving away from on-set firearms. I know that we get, I don't know how often it happens. I know we get calls sometimes when it does. And, you know, we certainly, people right now are talking about safety, but sometimes, you know, that doesn't, safety issues we get excited about them and then we forget when we get busy. And
so Heather, have there been discussions about, you know, putting it in contracts and saying, look, we're mandating that, you know, I don't know, that the armorer have a certain level of experience, or mandating that we have a safety officer on scene? I mean, do you think it's going to head to that direction to actually, you know, rather than relying on people to hire qualified armorers, to actually mandate this somehow in a contract?
And I do think Local 600 put out a resolution on the use of firearms and what we think should happen, including using replicas and all the things that I've been talking about. I think more will be contractually. You know, we're always trying to get safety issues resolved. When this happened, we were in the middle of our negotiations, and people, you know, our members did not trust, because of an incident like this. You know, our members had a very hard time trusting productions. They didn't want, you know, they're trying to learn their own safety, and, you know, they're looking for training or for onset safety because, and as I said, talking about concerted activity and what they can do to protect themselves, because they're concerned that employers aren't going to, and we're obviously going to press for employers to have those safety standards. And I think in the end they want them. Obviously in the end, I don't think employers want this to happen, and they're going to look for better ways to do it, to make it work more safely. So I think we'll see less firearms, but I don't know.
So I'm going to go to Bryan for his concluding remarks, and then I'll give Richard the last word. So Bryan, what are your takeaways from this? How can we do things better?
Well, I've used a firearm as a tool my entire adult life since right after 1992. And it's only as good or as bad as the hands that used it. I always say if the bad guys have them, you better hope the good guys do as well. Having said that, to want a world without firearms or without that kind of thing, if I didn't want that, it would be something wrong with me. So obviously, I would rather us not have to use firearms in real world or film if necessary. But I also like to say it's not all rainbows and puppy toes out there. In the real world, they're needed, unfortunately, still. And in the film world, SFX, special effects, just isn't quite where it needs to be to get the ultra realism that audiences want and demand in certain shows, especially military shows. I think that it will get there. And I think that when that happens, it's not just a muzzle flash, it's the ejection of the rounds, it's the reaction off of the blast of the muzzle. It's a lot of different things that go on there. But eventually special effects will get there, or VFX will get there. And when that does, that's going to be great, because then you will not have to have a live firearm on set. But just like the example I used initially about the set saying we're not going to use blanks, so now we're not going to have an armor at all, but we're still going to use live weapons. That is an example of lack of training and education. So at the end of the day, it's all about, and Heather, the unions, and everyone else, the states and everyone else getting together and saying, hey, look, we know you're going to try to save money in places, but you need to be educated and understand what you're dealing with, what types of persons you need to hire, and more about the things on a set that can affect and harm someone or kill someone if it's done improperly, and then enforce those regulations. You have to have somebody there saying, hey, this is what needs to happen, and then we're going to be keeping a close watch on you to make sure that it does.
All right, Richard, your concluding remarks, and if you're willing to predict what's going to happen on charges against, what's the outcome of the charges going to be against Alec and Hannah?
Sure. Well, first off, I'd say, everyone on a movie set wants safety. They want that, from everybody. Nobody foresaw this was going to happen. And that's a big issue. But here we're trying to determine who is criminally responsible. Civilly, there's already been settlements. There's going to be the payments. It's slam dunk, more or less, when something like this happens on a movie set. It's not a matter of liability anymore. It's just a matter of what are the appropriate damages. Everyone has a level of culpability in something like this. And so, Alec Baldwin, again, because he had multiple roles on this, certainly had a level of culpability. And that's why he settled his civil suit so quickly, because that was really a smart thing to do. What do I think is going to happen? Well, first, let's start with Ms. Gutierrez-Reed. I wouldn't be surprised if she did take some kind of a plea, especially if they offered her something where she's not going to get any custodial time. She might have to take some kind of felony with probation. Wouldn't shock me. I think there are defenses for her. Like I said, I think she made a lot of efforts to try to get things right. She was pulled out by other people who were her supervisors. Should she have left? We can all say that. But by not leaving, are we saying that is criminal? Is that such a bad thing? So willful and such a complete disregard by leaving that. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She leaves that weapon there. Now, again, we understand you leave a weapon unattended, what could happen, but is it rise to the level of willful disregard for human life to go and do another task? I'm not sure it does. So I think there is a defense there. I think with Baldwin, it is defensible at the end of the day. Despite his statements, they're going to cause him a little more trouble. He didn't believe there was a live round. He never really had any good reason to believe, unless we hear a lot more stories and verification that there was a lot of live rounds and shooting going off on the set. That's going to be a different set of facts. I've not seen that verified. There were some accidents, both were with blanks. So I think at the end of the day, if I'm going to make a prediction, he's going to get acquitted.
If he takes it all the way, and my prediction is that, yes, I agree on Hannah Gutierrez-Reed that she would accept some kind of plea bargain because she doesn't have the ability to pay for criminal defense attorneys as Alex does. But Alec is facing 5-year mandatory sentence if he is convicted of the manslaughter with the firearm enhancement. So if he, totally lost, he's looking at 5 years. So my sense is he'll take some kind of plea along the lines that David Halls did with the negligent handling of a firearm, but we will see. I really appreciate everyone attending. I mean, this has been a huge amount of attendance on this. It's a super important issue. And again, I hope that we achieved our goal of giving a vigorous debate on this in a way that pays respect to Halyna and Joel and Alec and everyone else involved in this. You've been watching the Rust Baldwin Lessons from a Tragedy. This has been a production of Beverly Hills Bar Association's entertainment law and criminal law sections. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe to BHBA. And if you want further information, go ahead and go to bhba.org. I'm Christopher Melcher. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we're out.